46 of America's 50 states share roughly 2/3 of the country's wealth between them, and the remaining third belongs entirely to New York and California. The same two states where nearly 500 of America's 760 billionaires call home. When people talk about American economic power, the conversation almost always revolves around the same places: Wall Street, Silicon Valley, or the Gulf Coast oil fields. That is where the money is, and that is where the attention follows. But sitting in the middle of all of that is a region of 34 million people, holding a fifth of the world's surface freshwater, and producing an economy larger than every country on Earth except the United States and China. And almost nobody talks about it. So what exactly is the Great Lakes Megaregion? What has it survived? And why are the conditions for its comeback stronger right now than they have ever been? The Great Lakes Megaregion covers portions of 8 American states: Minnesota, Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and New York, along with the Canadian provinces of Ontario and Quebec. It stretches across nearly 100,000 square miles and is built around 5 lakes: Superior, Michigan, Huron, Erie, and Ontario. Depending on where you draw the boundaries, the region is home to anywhere between 34 and 100 million people, making it one of the most populated areas in the world. That size produces a concentration of major cities that is hard to match anywhere else in the country. Chicago sits at the western edge with 9.6 million people in its metro area, the nation's second tallest skyline, and a rail network that has been the busiest in the country for 150 years running. Detroit sits at 4.3 million, Pittsburgh at 2.5, Cincinnati at 2.3, Cleveland at 2.2, Columbus and Indianapolis at 2.1 each, Milwaukee at 1.5, and Buffalo at 1.1. These cities are close enough and connected enough that together they function more like one giant economy than a collection of separate places. The numbers that economy produces are hard to ignore. The region supports over 1.5 million jobs through shipping, manufacturing, and raw materials alone. Its total annual economic output sits at around $6 trillion, which would make it the third largest economy in the world if it were its own country, behind only the United States and China, ahead of Japan, Germany, and the United Kingdom. So most people know the Great Lakes exist, but very few know how they became what they are, and even fewer appreciate just how much of American history runs directly through them. When the Erie Canal opened in 1825, it changed the entire logic of moving goods across the country. Before it existed, shipping 1 ton of cargo from the interior of the continent to the Atlantic coast cost roughly $100. Afterward, that same shipment cost under $9. The Great Lakes suddenly connected to global trade, and cities that had been small outposts on the frontier started growing into major industrial centers faster than anyone had seen before. What that opened up was one of the most important shipping networks in American history. The 5 lakes feed into the St. Lawrence Seaway, a waterway stretching 3,700 kilometers that links the heart of the continent directly to the Atlantic Ocean. For well over a century, coal, iron, and concrete moved along these routes in enormous quantities, supplying the raw materials that built the American industry. As of today, the St. Lawrence Seaway still supports 241,000 jobs and generates $46.8 billion in economic activity. At the Ambassador Bridge between Detroit and Windsor, Ontario, 10,000 trucks cross every single day, carrying $500 million worth of goods, much of it parts that cross the border multiple times before a finished product is ready. The manufacturing base that grew out of all this infrastructure is still the strongest of any region in the United States. Nearly 5 million people work in manufacturing across roughly 70,000 companies in the Great Lakes Megaregion. Michigan and Ontario together account for 22% of all car production in North America. Chicago's MHUB Innovation Center has helped launch over 1,700 products and raised more than $2 billion in investment. In Detroit, the old Michigan Central Station has been restored and turned into an innovation hub with over 100 startups working on transportation and clean energy technology. It is also one of the last parts of the country where an ordinary working family can still afford to buy a home and build a decent life. Something that is becoming increasingly rare as housing costs in most major American cities climb further out of reach every year. That combination of industrial strength and everyday affordability is part of what made the deindustrialization of the late 20th century so painful for the people who lived through it, because this was a region that had actually been delivering for ordinary people and then very suddenly stopped. After the Second World War, the American economy started moving in a new direction. Manufacturing gave way to finance, technology, and consumer spending. The shift happened faster than most people expected, and the Great Lakes region, which had built everything around industrial production, had no plan B. Between 1979 and 2010, the region lost around 2.7 million manufacturing jobs. Detroit, once one of the wealthiest cities in the country, went through 60 years of continuous population loss, dropping from 1.8 million residents to fewer than 700,000 at its lowest point, with entire neighborhoods going dark and blocks of houses left to fall apart. Cleveland went through much the same thing, as did Gary in Indiana and Youngstown in Ohio, along with dozens of smaller cities across the region. Millions of people packed up and moved south and southwest, following jobs that were either leaving or disappearing entirely. The picture that hardened in the national conversation during this period, the Rust Belt as a place of permanent decline, empty factories, and shrinking cities, was not completely wrong. What it missed was that the region had not given up. The infrastructure, the lakes, and the cities were all still there, smaller and quieter than before, but still functioning. And even as the manufacturing sector contracted, it never disappeared entirely. The people who stayed did not wait around for the rest of the country to notice, and that stubbornness turned out to matter more than anyone expected. The recovery happening across the Great Lakes Megaregion over the past 15 years does not look like the kind of dramatic turnaround that makes headlines overnight. It looks more like a long series of smaller decisions and investments that have been building on each other until the direction of travel became hard to deny. It started with the water. The Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, signed in 1972, began the slow work of cleaning up the industrial pollution that had essentially killed Lake Erie by the late 1960s. The Great Lakes Restoration Initiative of 2009 followed with federal money to continue that cleanup and tackle invasive species and habitat damage. The lakes that had been treated as little more than industrial plumbing for a century started coming back to life. And as they did, the cities on their shores became good places to live again in ways they had not been for a long time. Detroit grew in population in 2023 for the first time since 1957, adding just under 2,000 residents. The city has become a significant technology hub, and major events like the National Football League Draft in 2024 and the return of the Grand Prix to downtown streets are signs that something has shifted. Billions in corporate investment have followed across the wider region, drawn by the cost of doing business, the improving infrastructure, and the growing startup culture that used to exist almost exclusively on the coasts. The cost of living gap between Great Lakes cities and the major coastal metros has become one of the biggest practical reasons people are taking a second look at the region. The average home in San Francisco costs close to $1.4 million. In Chicago, that number is around $350,000. In Detroit, it is around $95,000. For anyone trying to start a business, raise a family, or simply build a stable life, those numbers are not abstractions. They represent a completely different set of possibilities, and the cost of living is only part of what is drawing people back. The Great Lakes hold 21% of all surface freshwater in the world and 84% of North America's, roughly 6 quadrillion gallons, enough water to cover the entire continental United States under 10 feet. That has always been true. What is changing is what it means now that other parts of the country are starting to run out. Phoenix and Las Vegas are running out of water from the Colorado River. That river supplies drinking water and irrigation to 7 states across the American West, and it has been overpromised for decades. Climate change is making the problem worse faster than most projections expected. The cities across the Sun Belt that absorbed so many of the people who left the Great Lakes region in the 1980s and 90s are now facing water shortages with no straightforward fix. Meanwhile, the Great Lakes Compact, a legal agreement signed in 2008 between 8 American states and 2 Canadian provinces, locks the water where it is by blocking large-scale diversions outside the basin. The water is not going anywhere, and what it is worth keeps growing. Industries that need large amounts of reliable fresh water, chip manufacturers, data centers, pharmaceutical companies are already starting to look at the Great Lakes region seriously. The bigger picture may be even more significant. Some researchers believe that freshwater security alone could dictate where Americans choose to live over the coming decades. Reversing the long migration away from the Midwest that defined the second half of the 20th century. A cautionary tale sits in Central Asia, where the Aral Sea was once one of the largest lakes on Earth. Decades of water diversion shrank it to less than 10% of its original size, leaving behind collapsed fisheries, contaminated land, and communities that never recovered. The Great Lakes Compact exists in part because the people of this region have seen what happens when a great body of water is treated as an unlimited resource, and decided they were not going to let that happen here. Chicago is one of the great cities of the world, with beaches on Lake Michigan, a financial sector that competes with the biggest in the country, and a technology and innovation economy that has been growing steadily for 20 years. Detroit has an auto industry that never went away and a growing tech presence, with a downtown that has attracted more investment and more new residents over the past decade than most people thought possible not long ago. Milwaukee has a revitalized waterfront and a food and brewing culture that has become central to its identity. Pittsburgh has transformed itself so thoroughly from a steel city into a center for robotics, healthcare, and university-driven research that it is now held up as a model for how a post-industrial city can reinvent itself. All of this is happening at a price point that coastal cities cannot come close to matching, and in a region sitting on top of what may be the most important natural resource of the next 100 years. The Great Lakes Megaregion was never really coming back because it never fully left. It is a working-class region that did what people said the Rust Belt could not do, which is adapt. And with freshwater scarcity accelerating, remote work giving people more freedom about where they live, and the cost of life on the coasts climbing further out of reach every year, the conditions for a full Great Lakes revival have arguably never lined up this well. The question was never whether this region would matter. The water, the infrastructure, the manufacturing base, and the cities themselves settled that long ago. The only question now is whether the rest of the country figures it out before the Great Lakes stops waiting to be noticed.